Oh, hey! I didn't see you come in. I wasn't actually expecting you so early, so you can just take a seat wherever. I'm still working on a video right now, but I'll be done soon. So just sit tight for like 5 minutes, okay? Thanks. You know they're making a 6th Garfield movie? The 2024 Garfield movie is just a week away now, and believe me, no one is more excited to see Chris Pratt botch another voice acting role than me. In the time I've been waiting for the movie to come out, I've been reminiscing on simpler times, when Garfield was voiced by William James Murray, and he was in the real world. But now that the new one is coming out soon, we can move on from the other 2 Garfield movies, and be at peace. Oh, I guess there were those too. Yeah, I've not been very subtle about the premise of this video. Today we are talking about the Garfield animated trilogy that came out in the late 2000s. I had to watch all 3 of these movies for this video, and because of that, I am going to curse you with the knowledge that I have unfortunately acquired. All I wanted to do was check out the movies and see if they were as good as I remembered. They were not.
Good evening, ladies and...
And so, without further delay, let's talk about these... movies. Let's start with the first of the trilogy, Garfield Gets Real. Despite being released directly to video in 2007, the movie actually started production in 1996, when Jim Davis started working on the script. He had worked on some smaller animated specials for television in the early 90s, and surprisingly, both live-action Garfields came out before this movie. Anyways, once Jim Davis finished the script, it was produced by Paws Inc., which was also founded by Jim Davis and famous for exclusively Garfield stuff. And you know 20th Century Fox had to get their grubby little mitts on Garfield. So they got the distribution rights and slapped this into every Best Buy, Walmart, and Target bargain bin on the 9th of August, 2007. Oh, it also had a theatrical release in Turkey exclusively, so I guess they're huge Garfield fans over there. It had a budget of 10 million big ones, and apparently only made 1.5 million. With Jim Davis only making 10% of the budget back, you wonder why this wasn't both the beginning and the end of this trilogy of films. But maybe there's something worth exploring here. Well, I already know, but you're about to find out. Let's get into it. The movie starts with a sunrise over the comic world, but it's a much more interesting shot than just that. Whenever the sun touches a building or a tree, it bursts into a cartoony form. It's a pretty cool sequence aside from the sunrise basically just being a wave of light. And the lighting in the next shot during the same sunrise is way later than a sunrise, so I'm not really sure what the thought process was there. Just an oversight? I don't know. Also, this bee is terrifying. I hate it. After that, it goes into one of the homes and shows us our favorite fat cat, voiced this time by the legendary Frank Welker, who's been in just about everything. Lorenzo Music was originally going to reprise his role from the Garfield cartoon, but unfortunately, he passed away a few years into production, so they had to make do. Before we get any further into the movie, I want to talk about the art direction. The film's art style is pretty charming, with them going for thin black outlines on the characters' models to simulate them being drawings, at least somewhat. Personally, I would have gone for thicker outlines, but then again, I'm not Jim Davis. With how the characters are stylized, the eyes and teeth tend to look glossy more often than not, and the end result is kinda yucky. Aside from these things, there are a lot of noticeable graphical inconsistencies and general oddities, such as lighting changing between shots in the same scene, certain effects just freezing altogether, and background characters repeating multiple times in the same shot. One special case in terms of style is Garfield, who seemingly has 2 separate models, one where he has more realistic cat proportions for like walking on all 4s and sitting like a cat, and one for his cartoony upright stature. It's a clever way of doing it, but the way they swap between them is kind of odd in motion. You gotta see it to believe it. Also, this art style kind of clashes with the premise of the movie a little bit, which I'll get into as we progress. Also, okay, this is kind of a tangent, but I have to talk about the lack of unique background characters. It's less about quality and more about quantity. Garfield, John, Odie, and the main cast all live in this comic book world, which is inhabited by unique comic book characters. But they can only get the rights to a handful of actual comic book characters, so all of the background characters look out of their minds. Like, what comic could this piano guy be a part of? Or this weird dude that looks like a hamburger? Why don't they work at the comic book studio like Garfield does? What does someone have to do to be able to work at the comic studios? Be funny? Because I know that's not the case for some of these guys. And if they don't work at the comic studios, despite knowing that they make comics for the real world, do they feel devoid of their real purpose if they do literally anything besides work for the comic studios? I don't know. The concept of this movie just confuses me, and I'm definitely reading too much into it. Anyways, every made-up background character in this movie is terrible, and I hate them. There are only a few of them made for this movie, so you'll see clones of the same background character everywhere, sometimes even in the same shot. I know most movies use copies of characters, but it's really noticeable here. I saw this little freak 3 times in different locations in the span of a few shots. It wouldn't be a problem if they didn't go for these huge, sprawling shots of the town and city. If they wanted to do that, they should have made more than 5 background characters. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is just the first movie of the trio. John drives Garfield and Odie to work, picking up Nermal and Arlene on the way. They all work at comic studios, and I guess are called into work to perform. It's a pretty interesting concept with how they take photos of them performing the scenes, and then they get turned into comic panels. It's actually a very interesting idea, but it doesn't really end up going anywhere due to the fact that the majority of this movie is spent outside of the comic book world. Speaking of comics, we are also introduced to Garfield's co-workers, who take the role of the supporting cast. Again, the only characters that are from real-life comics are the Garfield ones, Dagwood from Blondie, and this dog from something called Mother Goose and Grimm, which I've never heard of. The other supporting characters are completely original to this film. Billy Bear and Randy Rabbit, who share a comic that I don't remember the name of, a lunch lady named Zelda, who Garfield describes as a catering wench.
Zelda, Zelda, Zelda. How's my favorite catering wench today?
Which is just the sort of line that really makes you, contemplate your place in the universe. The phrase catering wench has truly changed me, I think. Then there's the best character in the entire film, Wally, and his wife, Bonita. But I forgot the name of Bonita as I wrote the notes, so I kind of just called her the Scythe in all of my notes. Every character aside from Garfield and Wally are completely uninteresting and don't really reap any reaction aside from a headache. There are a few other workers in comic book studios, such as the director, who, you can tell everything about him from his design. There is also Prop Boy, who is the boy who sets up the props and sets for each shot. You can tell his name is Prop Boy because he is a boy with the word prop on his shirt. Also, that's his actual real name, by the way. Betty is another character who works in the comic studio as the director's secretary, and she is certainly designed. Aside from being incredibly top-heavy, nothing wrong with that, just a bit odd to see in this movie, but her eyes are super small, almost dots, kind of like how Carl Weezer's eyes are, but no, they're just normal eyes, but really, really small, and I hate it. As I was watching this movie, I wrote down that she's basically Peter Griffin, Lois Griffin, Velma, and Daphne put together. Which, I wasn't wrong, but it's just a weird way of describing it. And then there's Eli, who works the projector and camera. He is, without a doubt, one of the best characters in this movie, aside from Wally and Garfield. He isn't, a super standout character or anything. He just does his job and is generally pretty chill. And I really like his little setup he has for picking the sets and taking pictures of the characters to be panels for the comic. Again, it's an interesting concept that nothing is done with. Why would you not use this whole area for the movie rather than going to the real world, which was done twice in the years before this movie? Not a very smart choice, TBH. Anyways, once they're finished making the comics, they get to watch people in the real world react to their comics? I can't even begin to question how this works. I know it's a cartoon and I'm overanalyzing, but how many newspapers would you have to look through where it's just some grumpy-looking 60-year-old not laughing at all? Though, to be fair, this movie was made 17 years ago, so it's only fair. Maybe newspapers were more popular in 2007. I suppose this is a good time to segue into the premise of this movie, because Garfield sees some good-looking hot dogs from a hot dog cart, and it basically becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back for Garfield's dilemma. Garfield is tired of his daily life of constantly working in the comic studios, and wants a change of pace. So, in a freak accident while trying to get hot dogs, he gets transported to the real world, and has to find a way home afterwards. Now, surely this is where the film gets interesting, right? A character being transported to real life, there has to be some interesting concepts to use there. And you would be correct. Nobody told the writers for Garfield Gets Real about that, though, because this is without a doubt one of the most wasted ideas for any movie I could think of. The real world is identical to the comic world in terms of style. The only things that change are the way the world is designed, like how buildings are made and stuff. All of the characters still have wacky and zany proportions, including the talking animals. Yes, of course there are talking animals in the real world. Why wouldn't there be? Well, if the art style doesn't change, then surely Garfield has some trouble getting accustomed to real-world physics, right? No, because the physics in the real world are exactly the same. Despite Garfield specifically mentioning how people can actually get hurt in the real world, but nobody really does.
Oops, sorry, pal. I forgot you can really get hurt in the real world.
You could probably call this movie Garfield Goes to New York, and it wouldn't need any major script changes because of how similar the real world and cartoon world look. If there is no difference, then what is the point? The whole point is that he's being put into, like, a new world he's not accustomed to. Why is nothing different? The only major difference is that, like, nobody recognizes Garfield as, like, the comic book character, which makes sense. Nobody sees a kind of fat orange tabby cat on the street and goes, "Hey dude, it's Garfield." That just doesn't happen anymore. And that's not even the worst offender. Get ready for this. Are you sitting? You're gonna want to be sitting for this. There is no mention of lasagna in this movie. Not even once. How could they forget one of the most iconic parts of Garfield's character? They replaced it with hot dogs in this movie for some reason? Because there would never be an Italian restaurant selling lasagna in New York. Right? Right? This movie's pissing me off. So I'm just gonna skim through the rest of the plot based off of my notes. Garfield and Odie get caught up in this posse of cats. One of them's name is Shaggy, one of them is this stupid oafish-looking dog, and one of them is this stereotypical feminine character who's, like, accompanied by French music, but has an Australian accent? Okay. Once Garfield decides real life sucks and he actually has to, do work to get food in the real world, he tries to get back into the comic world, but to no avail. Then, as he goes to sleep that night, he sees a comic panel of his girlfriend complaining about how fat he is, and immediately goes, "Oh, I miss my wife." Then goes to the publishing company of the newspaper he's in to try and get his job back. After talking to the CEOs, which consist of 2 Psychonauts characters and Germa 985, they agree to let him back in the comic if he comes back in 24 hours, because, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense, because they hated his performance to try and get his role back. Then 2 weird muscular dogs later, which again, you wouldn't be able to tell if these were cartoon characters or real-life dogs, because there's no difference in the worlds. Anyways, 2 fetish dogs later, and Garfield is tied up in a burning building with Odie. And Wally, the absolute MVP, who's watching them in the cartoon world from that big projector, he has to build a divide to transport cartoon characters to the real world safely, and ends up being one of the 3-man team to rescue Garfield. Also, there's this weird story arc between Wally and his wife where she's just insufferable to him the entire movie, but then she falls in love with him after he insults her? I don't know, it never really sat right with me. Hey guys, it's Goose. I was gonna show you a clip of this actually happening in the movie, but showing that clip not only demonetized the video, it blocked it worldwide, even though the entire movie is on YouTube. So, have this Wally montage instead. Anyways, after they rescue Garfield and Odie, they all get together and have a big dance party because this is an animated film from 2007 and God hates me. So in the end, Garfield Gets Real was an unfunny, erroneous mess full of plot holes, graphical inconsistencies, poor story decisions, and just overall weak execution of a somewhat interesting concept. Now, after only making back 10% of its budget, you have to wonder why they would make 2 more. And would you believe me if I told you that Garfield Gets Real is the best one of the trilogy? One year later, on August 5th, we were blessed with Garfield's FunFest, a sequel to the titular 2007 smash hit. Same studio, same director, and this time it was released theatrically in 9 countries, Brazil and Portugal being the most profitable places for the film. Now, this movie. Oh man, this movie. Hi, Future Goose here. The first thing I want to say isn't even about the movie itself. I'm doing the editing right now, and as if being a terrible film wasn't enough, Garfield's car crash is split into 17 separate parts that I had to download for the editing, which took ages, and that's not even the worst of it. But I'll let the other guy take it away. I don't get angry watching movies very often, but it was so hard to even think about how to write a script talking about this movie that I almost considered not even making this video. It's just so nothing. But everything about the nothing is infuriating. For starters, this movie's premise is even less interesting than the first film. Garfield does a shitty stand-up routine with Arlene for the yearly Comic Studios talent show called FunFest. But this year, Arlene branches off of Garfield and decides to do a dancing act, and he gets cucked 2 seconds later by this Spanish cat named Ramon. So Garfield has to go on an adventure to find the origin of all humor, which is like this weird lake that has funny water in it. I don't know, it's called Funny Water. And then a Tim Conway frog takes Garfield to a humor boot camp, and then it doesn't amount to anything because it just becomes the funny was inside of you all along. Literally just the there is no secret ingredient moral story from Kung Fu Panda. Come to think of it, Garfield did have way more fat jokes made about him in this movie. And the outfit the Tim Conway frog wears looks pretty Asian-ish. Hang on 1 second. Oh my god. Oh my god! This movie came out 2 months after Kung Fu Panda! There was no way they just ripped off some of the characters in the ending of the movie and put them in Garfield's FunFest. That is crazy! Why would they do that? Were they that unconfident in their original idea that they just ripped off the Kung Fu Panda movie and put it in the second half of the Garfield No. Let me calm down. We're still only halfway through this. Not to mention the first 15 minutes of Garfield's FunFest is just a repeat of Garfield Gets Real. Garfield wakes up and eats breakfast, him and John banter about the plot of the movie, Garfield and Odie go with John to pick up Nermal and Arlene for work, they go to the cafeteria, then to the auditorium to do some comic shit. A third of this film is the first movie, the final third of this movie is just Kung Fu Panda, and the middle third is something I could have thought up in my fucking sleep! The only difference between this movie and the last movie is like the lighting is very slightly better and more consistent, but that is all! Moving on to that middle third, the whole journey Garfield goes through in this movie is just so much nothing. He encounters like 3 different things that try and stop him in his tracks to get to the funny water, but they stop him for a total of like 2 minutes each. And the way they do it is just so poorly done. Like there's this part with this weird German crossing guard that stops Garfield, and Garfield's like, "Hey, let me out of the way, I gotta drink the funny water." And the crossing guard's like, "Okay, I need to stop you and see if you actually need to drink the funny water." And then he just makes Garfield tell 3 terrible jokes, and then he goes, "Okay, you definitely need to drink the funny water. You can go on now. I'm not going to lift the barricade, so..." Like, what? That was nothing! That scene added 0 substance or humor to the movie. It just padded out the runtime. And the same goes for the other 2, which equate to Garfield telling 1 joke to make some crocodiles laugh, and then him having to choose between 2 doors and taking the wrong door followed by the right door. He walks through 2 doors, and that's a major plot point. This is so exhausting. This movie ends with Garfield fighting the weird human cat character who I've already forgotten the name of, who just ends up being Nermal in a big robot suit, which, alright, that's like the only interesting part of this movie. The rest of it is just fucking nothing. My eyes trying to watch this movie is like when you try to touch magnets of matching poles together. They just push each other apart constantly. I looked up to see if anyone else had any thoughts about this movie, and there's this reviewer named Paul Havis who said it best in his review of Garfield's FunFest. Maybe the problem is that the Garfield creator, Jim Davis, who wrote this movie, can't translate his humor into an 80-minute film. What's funny in a 3-panel strip becomes drawn out and forced in a feature-length film. See, this guy understands. Thank you. Thank you for understanding. The obvious video game structuring of the scenes is to be expected, I guess, in these days of rampant voracious synergy. But that doesn't make the film any more palatable. Wait, video game structure? No, it can't be. It can't, no, there's no way. Hang on, dude! Oh my god! This movie was just made for the tie-in DS game! What? That explains why it's so terrible and why they didn't care at all. Yes, there was a DS game made for this film that came out a month before it even released. And surprise, it explains perfectly why each scene of the movie felt so inconsequential and gimmicky. Because each one of them is a level for the shitty game. In all seriousness, the pixel art in this game doesn't look half bad, when they're not showing 240p screenshots from the movie, that is. Honestly, it looks better than the movie, but something tells me this game did not get very good reviews. Oh, I looked back in time, and turns out the first movie also had a DS game. Though something tells me that this one is even worse, as it's half the length of the second game, it's in this terrible 3D style the DS often does not mesh with, and was entirely based around the touchscreen as a mechanic, so, yeah, no, that's enough about the games, I think. But wait, we're not done yet. There is one more film in this iconic blockbuster trilogy. And by blockbuster, I mean it makes me want to hit myself with cinder blocks! Garfield's Pet Force premiered theatrically in 20 different countries, such as Poland, Italy, and Spain, and ended up being the most profitable film in the trilogy. Somehow. The one thing I can say about this movie is that it's better than FunFest. It's not much, but that achievement is better than nothing. Now you know my official ranking of the worst film trilogy. I gotta give it to this movie though. There's more progression in the first half of this movie than the first two films combined. I had never seen this movie before, so I assumed that Garfield just gets transformed into a superhero, but they just come from the comic world to the cartoon world, which is so incredibly convoluted. To summarize, fantastical versions of the Garfield cast from another dimension, called the comic dimension, which is separate from the comic dimension that Garfield's lived in for the last two movies, which was retconned to be the cartoon world, but they also call it the newspaper world sometimes. The times are changing. Try to keep up, nerd. Anyways, they get transported to the cartoon world, and the superhero version of Garfield, whose power is spitting green globs? No, I'm not making that up or stealing that from an Oni Plays bit. He really just does do that. Anyways, he has to gather a new super team, which consists of Garfield's friends that make up his super team in the first place. But in the end, fat, short, normal Garfield saves the day, and they do like a weird little dance in space or something, I don't know. So when you think about it, this is just Garfield Gets Real, but for the comic book Garfield. It's just Garfield with a cape going from his comic world to what's technically the real world for him. This is noticeably the only movie in the trilogy to have Liz, the veterinarian, show up as a character. Namely, the main antagonist, which is odd, but like, okay, cool, whatever. The only other comments I can really make is that Garfield looks slightly better in this one. Whether they touched up his original model or just got more comfortable animating it, it looks better. And this movie has the only reference to lasagna in this whole trilogy, but it is only spoken. For some reason, these films decided to change Garfield's favorite food to hot dogs, a choice I can only imagine being made due to hot dogs being easier to model. Or maybe all of the models of lasagna were just too expensive on Turbo Squid, who knows. The last thing I can say about this movie is that it did not have a shitty DS game to release alongside it, which is unfortunate. I would have loved to show more footage of a shitty Garfield game for the funnies. But all good things must come to an end. So it was quite a surprise for me when the final film of this trilogy was the nail in the coffin for Garfield films for a good while. There was the show on Cartoon Network, or was it Nickelodeon? I'm not really sure. But he had a show for a while, where this very niche meme came from. The new Garfield movie is coming out in like a week, and not only does it look like a sight for my sore eyes, but it looks like it's not just being made to have a tie-in DS game. I'm genuinely interested in seeing how that movie turns out being, but regardless, it is guaranteed to be better than these three atrocities. There were a few small jokes and some concepts from these movies that could have been at least decent if they were done correctly, but they fall flat in almost every single category. I'm not usually a fan of being a comically critical cartoon character, but come on. Some movies are just better off not being made in the first place. Alas, that is going to be the end of this video for me. But before we head out, I've got just a few things to mention, so stick around and check out this cool fan art while I talk, okay? I have some social medias. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Newgrounds, which I don't really use all that much. All of those are going to be in the description of this video. You should also consider maybe buying a commission from me. I take art and music commissions, and I'm free to take commissions on Twitter, Instagram, or hell, I'll even take an email. That's on my YouTube channel somewhere, I think. I also have a Discord server in my description I'd suggest joining, since you're able to talk to me directly. Not in a parasocial way. I don't mean it like that. I don't know, I think it's interesting hearing input from my fans. Anyways, I'd recommend becoming a channel member if you can. I call them headliners because I think that sounds cool. It's only $3 a month, and you get some neat perks, like a private channel in the Discord server I just mentioned, secret polls for deciding future videos, access to some cool emotes in the streams, sometimes you get access to videos a couple days early, and you get your name in the credits here. And finally, tag me in any fan art you make in the social medias I'm in, or post it on the Discord server, and I'll put them in the end of the video here. I think that's everything now, so I'm gonna end it off here. My name is Goose. I thank you very much for watching. And, go and buy yourself a Wendy's Frosty. You deserve it. Get some french fries, too, to dip it in. Now get lost!